superintendent who retired in 2010, and the Packers won the Super Bowl, and I got started on this crazy thing that I'm doing. I never expected to be doing this. I never expected to write any Packer books, but this is sure easier than dealing with school districts and all the things, especially nowadays. You know, I retired a while back, but holy mackerel. So what I did is I've written about Packer games. So all of my books that you'll see here and this database, this has every Packer game ever played. 1,520 games. And so for somebody who loves the Packers and likes all the information, you can always find the statistics online, but you can't find a summary of the game because you have to have the Green Bay Press-Gazette to kind of look at an old game. So I decided, well, gee, I'm going to summarize all the games for people, who had somebody that went to the game in, let's say, 1952, their cousin or something. They could look it up and say, hey, is this what happened in the game? And, have a conversation. So that's what the database is. Now, that is the last thing I'm ever doing, except to keep it up to date each year. But over here, the four books that I've written are also, come on in, you guys. Welcome. These are all about the games, about the Packers and the Bears. This goes up to 2019. And as you can see, it's all just games, one after another, and all the highlights of the games. The one we're going to do today here is this one, Green Bay's 13 championship seasons. And then over here, the old NFL championship games before the Super Bowl, which the Packers were in many of them. And then this one, and I'll wait till these guys got settled because there's a story behind this one. This is the secret I didn't want to share. I'll let them get in here. Sure. I'll tell you about those of you that weren't here. This is about the Packers and the Giants. And here's the big secret. You got to promise not to hold it against me. I'm originally from New York. But I came out here to college and never went back. So I knew a good thing when I saw one, but I went to Marquette, not to Madison. So don't hold that against me. But I love Madison. I pay my taxes right, so I don't care if Marquette loses to Madison anymore now that I'm 70 years of age. But it was a great rivalry and always will be. But I ended up at Marquette and never went back. And all these books over here are about the games played, nothing else, and they're all $10. They make great Christmas presents. If you want a little autograph, we could do that too. And then if you really want to get something, this is beyond anything I ever thought I would do. I wrote about every Packer game, but it's all online. It's a database. And if you know anybody that really, 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 really loves the Packers and all the statistics and all the games played, go on the website, which is on that card, and you'll see this. But just so you know, this is really, with 1,520 games, this is really for the devoted Packer fan. And it's kind of neat because nobody's ever written about all the games before. The statistics are out there, but you can't find a summary of the game. I thought, if somebody wanted to see the game their grandfather went to in 1947, they could find how many yards rushing and how many yards passing, but they'll never find out the action of what happened in the game. So that's what this is about. Okay?
Thank you for being here.
You bet. So my name is Jim Rice, like I said. I'm going to take a little sip of this water so I don't dry out during our conversation. And let's see. I'll put the water here. I don't want to put it on that piano. Let's see. So we are going to talk today about only the good stuff. 13 championship seasons, no losing. And when people talk about Packer history, and they say, well, what are the best teams? Which teams are the greatest? And how everybody compares teams. You have to start with these 13 teams as part of the greatest list of Packer teams. We have the most NFL championships at 13. The Bears and the Giants come second to us. But we have quite a history, and what we're going to do today is we're going to go through all the winning, and if I can do this okay, let's see, this is always interesting. Let's see. Here. There we go. Sometimes, well, I'm sure some of you know, sometimes this is like a mystery. Technology is a challenge for me, but I'm able to do it pretty well, I think, but it always makes me very nervous. So the 13 championships that the Packers have won, we're going to start with 1929. I have a little sheet in my hand so I can remember to tell you what the team record was in that year, so I had to cheat a little bit. When you talk about the Packers, of course, you can't talk about anything unless you start with Curly. Curly Lambeau was a visionary. He had the idea that not only did people want more football, other than college football, but that they wanted an exciting game, and Curly, who had gone to Notre Dame for a semester and played under Knute Rockne, Curly believed, like Knute Rockne did, that the future of football was passing the football, not running the ball down each other's throats all game long to a final score of 3-3. You know, Curly knew, and others knew, that that wasn't going to keep people's interest. 3-3? How boring can you get? So Curly believed that passing the football was the future of the game. And a lot of people looked at him kind of like he was crazy. Because, you know, back in the day, they liked to pound that football, and it was man against man, and that, you know, you were a real sissy if you threw the ball over everybody. So he really changed the way football was looked at and the potential for the game. Curly's statue, of course, near Lambeau Field, right over here. Vince Lombardi's statue on the other side. And Curly is always pointing because he believes in the future. That was what he believed. He believed there was a much better future for the pro game. Here's a different version of the pointing. And for those of you, when we get to 1965, I'll tell you a little bit more about this, because Vince Lombardi did not like Curly.
Oh.
Yeah, I'll tell you why when we get there. But it's the two greatest Packer leaders. Curly didn't care about Vince. Vince was just, you know, but Vince thought he was so special himself, and there's a good story behind it. So the first team that wins a championship is 1929. This is still one of the greatest teams in Packer history. They were undefeated. They had one tie. They gave up only 22 points all year, and even in a low-scoring time, that was still incredible. They were just phenomenal. This team, as I mentioned, is still considered in the top. But remember now, back in these days, there was only one division of teams. There was no final game. So the team at the top of the pile, and sometimes there were 26 teams, sometimes there were 15. It changed a lot in the early days of football. But there was one division. So the team that had the best record on the top of that division was the champion. So that's what happened in 39. In 1930, it's the same way. And in 1930, the Packers are not undefeated, but they're 10-3-1. They're really a good team, and they win the next championship because they're on the top of that list. They finish first, but they're not quite as good as 1929. And the last of Curly's 3 straight championships, because Curly was the first in NFL history to win 3 titles in a row. And we all know the only other team to do it are the Lombardi Packers. No other team in football has won 3 championships. So it is very special. And in 1931, they win again. And this is the last of the 3 straight championships, but this was a great team. And their record was 12-2-1, so they only lost 2 games. And they were a fine team. And so the Packers have their first 3 straight championships. They finish at the top of the division, they win. Now watch what happens in 1932. And it should surprise you. Oh, before we get there, great photo from the 20s. Curly Lambeau on the left, Johnny Blood McNally, the great Packer Hall of Famer, number 26, being carried off the field, and Dave Woodward, who was the trainer on the team. Great photo because Johnny Blood McNally, who's also in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, he was like the Paul Hornung of his day. He drove Curly Lambeau crazy like Horning and McGee drove Lombardi crazy. But Johnny Blood was a partier, very social, but he was a really bright guy. He wrote poetry. He did lots of things that football players typically don't do. And so a lot of people think he was a genius. And he certainly was in football, and he made the Hall of Fame. So what happens now, another guy shows up to help the Packers win those 3 straight championships, Mike Michalski, an offensive guard. And the last guy that helps lead them to those 3 straight titles, 29, 30, and 31, is my favorite guy of all time. His name is Cal Hubbard. Those of you that collect cards, especially baseball cards, should know that this is a 1954 baseball card. And before I give you the next slide, which tells you why, I want to tell you that this guy is one of the greatest Packers ever. He is the only person in the Pro Football Hall of Fame and in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Only guy. He demanded a trade from the New York Giants in 1928. He comes to the Packers, and when did they start winning? 1929, 30, and 31. Cal Hubbard was a big reason why. He was an offensive and defensive lineman, and a big guy at 250 pounds. The guys today are a little bit bigger and a little bit heavier.
Yeah.
But here's the back of his card in 1954 baseball. All-time great tackle with the Green Bay Packers. And he did not like living in New York when he was with the Giants. So he demanded a trade to Green Bay. They even did that back in the 20s. He demanded a trade. He said, if you don't trade me to Green Bay, I quit. And so the Giants wanted to get something for him, so they traded him to Green Bay. And then what happened after his career, he retires and becomes a tremendous umpire in Major League Baseball, and that's how he got into the Hall of Fame in baseball. And those of you that know anything about the 50s, he was like the head of all the umpires in the 50s. He was a really big baseball guy and football guy, and there it is, umpire, supervisor, American League. So those 3 guys, McNally, Johnny Blood, Michalski, and Hubbard, lead the Packers to those 3 straight championships in the 20s and 30s. Now look at what happens in 1932. Kind of looks a little weird, doesn't it?
Green Bay 10 wins, 3.
In today's football, the Packers would be the champion because they would have 10 wins and 3 losses. But back, well, before 1970, so fairly recently, before 1970, because of all the teams in those big 1 division that they had, they split the teams into 2 divisions, okay, to finally have a final championship game. But in this time right here, ties were not counted in the final standings. So the 6 ties for the Bears, the 4 for the Lions, soon to be the Lions in 1934, they'll move, and the 1 for the Packers, they act like they never played those games. They put them in the final numbers that there were ties, but they don't count them. So 6 and 1 is better than 10 and 3, right? I mean, I don't like math, but I know 6 and 1 is better than 10 and 3. So these 2 teams, Chicago and Portsmouth, they tie for first place, even though the Packers have 4 more wins than they do. So it kind of rubs that Chicago rivalry a little bit. So what happens, to add insult to injury, right? The Packers are like, well, that's the rules. We won 10 more games or 4 more games, but we're not the winners. But what happens is this game between the Bears and the Portsmouth Spartans is played indoors on a very, very cold day in Chicago. Whoever thought they moved games in the 1920s indoors? Wasn't it always like they were, too tough to do that? They moved the game indoors to the original Chicago stadium. They played the game on an 80-yard field that was more narrow than a typical football field. So it was kind of a real questioning kind of game. The Bears win that game on a controversial play, and the Bears are the champs in 1932. So the Packers, while it's fair, that kind of rubs that rivalry even more. because the Packers, look, they had so many more wins than the other two teams. So the Bears win in 32, but the Packers have great players in the 30s. Arnie Herber, first great quarterback after Curly and Red Dunn. He threw most of those touchdown passes to the great Don Hutson. Also, we have Clark Hinkle, the great running back from Pennsylvania, who was probably the top player in college in 1932. And back then, none of the great players in college came out to the Midwest, to Chicago or Green Bay, because it wasn't easy to get there. And so they stayed out east. But Clark Hinkle saw the Packers play, and he wanted to play for Green Bay. So that became a big thing, because then the Packers got more attention on the East Coast, and more of the great players kept coming our way. So Hinkle is a great player, along with Arnie Herber, and then of course the great Don Hutson. This motto for the card, I believe, is taken at Wrigley Field because of that scoreboard up on the top left-hand corner, I believe is Wrigley. But Hutson is known by most folks as the Babe Ruth of football, because Babe Ruth hit all the home runs and Don Hutson caught all the touchdown passes. He caught 99 touchdowns in his career. And what is funny about him, he debuted for the Packers in 1935, and Curly held him out of the first game that he was going to play. And Hutson was like, well, why? And he said, well, the next game we have to play, Don, is against the Bears. So I don't want them to see how good you are. And so I'm going to hold you out of the first game. So he did that. And the first game against the Bears the next week, the first play, Arnie Herber throws a 80-yard touchdown pass to Don Hutson, and everybody is like shocked, because not only is he so fast, but who ever heard of an 80-yard touchdown pass back in the day? That was pretty rare. So those three guys, Hinkle, Herber, and Hutson, lead the Packers to the 1936 championship game. Now in 36, because of that debate about the Chicago ties and all that kind of stuff, because of that debate of who the champion was, they split all the teams into the final two divisions. So there'd be no question who the champion is. There'd be one final game, and that would be the end. And we'd really know who the champ was, because they argued in 32 a lot about that. So in 36, the Packers finally get to one of those championship games as the champion of the Western Division. It's interesting in this photo here. Here's a young Don Hutson right here next to Clark Hinkle, number 41. And this team, and where's my little cheat sheet? This team won 10 games, lost 1, and tied 1. They're a very good team. They end up playing the Boston Redskins for the 1936 championship. Now the Boston Redskins are ready to move to Washington, D.C. the next year in 1937. But because the Boston fans didn't show up for a lot of the games when the Redskins were in Boston, the owner didn't want to give them the championship game. So he said, let's move the game to New York, and then I'll take my team down to Washington, D.C. after the New York game. So that's what they did. And so the Packers played the Redskins in December of 36 for the championship. This is an old 1936 newspaper that I bought. As you can see, it wasn't very expensive with all the tears in it, but it had nice information about that game against the Redskins. And the Packers really were a very strong team and won the game 14-7. 1938, they get to the championship game, but they lose to the New York Giants. They lose in New York, and then in 1939, they play the Giants again. And this team, 1939, their record was 9 wins, 2 losses, and no ties. But this is a very, very interesting championship. Because, I'm going to take a quick sip of water here, because Curly Lambeau moved the game out of Green Bay. So the Giants were coming out here for a rematch from the Giants won in 38. And Curly decides, I'm moving the game out of Green Bay, I'm moving it to State Fair Park in Milwaukee. Can you imagine? But you've got to remember, the Packers would not have survived if it wasn't for Milwaukee. Milwaukee was a key piece of how the Packers were able to maintain enough finances to keep their heads above water. In fact, If the NFL had their way, they would have told the Packers to move to Milwaukee because the teams hated traveling from Milwaukee up to Green Bay. It was hard back in the day. So they wanted everybody, move them down to Milwaukee, more people, all that kind of stuff. Well, Curley knew that Milwaukee was very good for the Packers, and so he moved this championship game down to State Fair Park. It was played inside the racetrack, where horses were running at the time, not cars. And it was a good game. The Packers won 27-0. They just beat the daylights out of the Giants. And what happened is probably halfway through the fourth quarter, some of the fans began creeping down from the grandstand to stand on the track and watch the game. And they probably stepped on some you-know-what to do that from those dear horses that were running there. So what happens is they come down, get close to the field, and they start yelling at the Giants and, being Green Bay Packer fans. And it's kind of toward the end of the game, so you know how some of them are by the end of the game. And so it was a little bit rambunctious, and the Packers do win the game. And on the way out of the parking lot at State Fair Park, somebody threw a bottle at the Giants bus, and they were just happy to get out of town. And it was really something. And this is Curley's 5th championship now, okay? 29, 30, 31, 36, 39. Now, he has one more championship, but the 1940s belong to the Chicago Bears. That's the reason I have this card. Also, to tell you something about the Bears. If you have a Chicago Bear fan, okay, now, well, let me tell you up front, I have a whole new respect for the Bears after doing all this, because the Packers wouldn't have survived without Halas or the Bears. It was just part of the way those two teams, the rivalry and everything, it kept people focused. George Halas loved the Packers, even though he would never say that. He came up in 1957 to help build that referendum, to pass the referendum to build City Stadium, that ultimately becomes Lambeau Field. I mean, he loved the Packers even though they had that rivalry. And Halas needed the rivalry to keep his fans, kind of coming to the game. So the Bears win in 1940, 41, 43, and 45. This card is very interesting too, because I'm going to tell you something to tell a Chicago Bear fan if they ever bother you too much and you don't know how to shut them up. Okay? And it's really a nice thing to say, and they might not even get it, but you'll get it in just a minute. Top left-hand corner in the double-breasted suit, that's George Halas's brother. He was the businessman, the operator, taking care of all the ticket sales. Right below him, right here in this Chicago Bear jacket, short little guy, is George Halas. Next to Halas, on his left, next to number 80, is the greatest quarterback in Chicago Bear history. He hasn't played since 1952. They haven't had a better quarterback since 1952. I was born in 53. So in my entire lifetime, the Bears never had a better quarterback than that guy, Sid Luckman. Sid Luckman led the Bears to the four championships in the 40s, and he was a great quarterback. Halas handpicked him to be his quarterback when he graduated from Columbia University. So if you get a Bear fan, you just don't know what to say to him, all you have to do is say, well, why is your greatest quarterback, why isn't he playing anymore? And then you go, they don't even know who their greatest. Some think it's Jim McMahon. Jim McMahon was not their greatest quarterback. And so if you just say that to them and let it sit in for a while and they don't know who it is, then you say, well, I'm not surprised that you don't know who he is because he hasn't played since 52. And then maybe they'll get the idea that they're not better than us and never will be.
No.
But you might have to tell them that. They might not want to admit it up front. But Sid Luckman, great quarterback, and they haven't replaced him since then, since 52. So the Bears are strong in the 40s. Finally, let's see if I can get this to go here. Oh, this is a cover of a program that I bought because it shows Don Hudson on the cover against the Bears. It's a 1941 program. Then, the next slide. Come on now, don't go on me, battery. Come on now. Why are we not doing anything? There we go. 1944, the Packers finally break through and finish ahead of the Bears. The Bears finish second, and the Packers win the 44 championship by beating the New York Giants again, 14-7. And one of the greatest players in that game is a great Wisconsin guy, Ted Fritsch. Now, Ted Fritsch, I would put him in the same category as Bart Starr, Donald Driver, Charles Woodson. This guy was a better person than he was a football player. I mean, there are some Packers that are better people than players, and we know who they are. There's probably more of them than I'm mentioning. But Fritsch was one of them. When he retired after the 44, not this game, but after a couple more seasons, he became a football coach in northeastern Wisconsin. The football field at Notre Dame High School is named after Ted Fritsch, and Ted Fritsch's son also played in the NFL as well. So he is a great Packer. He's from Spooner, Wisconsin, and he's really just a tremendous guy for the Packers and helped them break through and bring down those Chicago Bears. Also, the great Tony Canadeo was on that team as well. Tony's number 3, is up on the Lambeau Field facade as a retired number. He's a Chicago boy who came to Green Bay and became their first 1,000-yard rusher in Packer history. He also was very involved in the team after he played. He was part of the executive board. I believe he was an announcer at some point. But Tony Canadeo, great Green Bay Packer. The end of the 40s, Curly resigns after the 49 season. He leaves with 6 world championships, which is one more than George Halas has, so that makes him happy. And they're a failing team at the end of the 40s. The executive board got real involved, and Curly didn't like that involvement, so he quit. Everybody leaves Green Bay. He went down to coach the Chicago Cardinals after he left. You know, when Favre and Rodgers and all these guys do what they did, it's awful, but it's happened all the time. Well, we didn't know it back then. That's the only difference. So Curly resigns. The first guy to take over is a former Chicago Bear. He is the assistant coach of the Chicago Bears, Gene Ronzani. He went to Marquette, and he was a terrible coach. Just terrible. The 50s were just like the 70s and 80s were. Awful. And the next 2 guys that coached the Packers before Lombardi shows up are the 2 guys in the 3rd row from the bottom here on the far left and the far right. Scooter McLean and Lyle Blackburn were their names, but they weren't any good. The Packers in the 50s were bad. The good players were there, but they were bad. And you'll see in a minute what happens. The greatest player in the 50s for the Packers, and I love this guy, this is Bobby Dillon. When the NFL in 2021 had their 100th anniversary, they nominated and put into the Hall of Fame certain players that they overlooked. And one of the players they overlooked, they felt, was Bobby Dillon of the Packers. He is still the all-time interception leader for the Packers, still to this day. And he was legally blind in one eye. I mean, he was that good. And so Bobby Dillon, just a great Packer. Notice the uniforms, blue and gold. That's before Lombardi. A lot of times Curly and other coaches had blue and gold uniforms to honor Curly's relationship with Notre Dame. That's why they were blue and gold. Lombardi came in green and gold, and that's the way it's been ever since. You know, New Yorkers, they come in, they just shake everything up, and he sure did. So Dillon gets into the Hall of Fame, and Lombardi arrives in 1959. He comes from the sidelines of the New York Giants as an assistant coach, and he takes the job somewhat reluctantly because he was a big New Yorker. His wife loved shopping in New York. She did not like Green Bay, but he took the job because he felt he had been passed over for other coaching positions because he was a dark-skinned Italian man. That's the way it was back then. I remember as a youngster in New York, Italians were on the bottom of the pile. I mean, you didn't treat them like they were on the bottom, but Italians, and the Irish were too. I'm Irish. The Irish were once on the bottom too. And Lombardi felt he had been overlooked because of his dark skin. And that has a big role to play when he comes to Green Bay now for the Packers. Because as you know, in the 60s, the whole race issue heats up. And Lombardi dealt with it wonderfully, as you'll see in a minute. The first guy he meets, he comes here to Green Bay. The first guy he meets, you know who I thought that was? Jackie Gleason. Do you remember Jackie Gleason, the old comedian? I thought it was Jackie Gleason, but it really is Jack Vanese. Jack Vanese is the biggest unsung hero in Packer history. He drafted all of the great players in the 50s, Horning, McGee, Starr, Gregg, Dowler, on and on and on, Nitschke. But nobody expected them to do anything. The coaches didn't expect a lot. So the players got happy losing because they got the same amount of money. So they got very comfortable. They got very lackadaisical, and they thought, well, if I'm going to get the same amount if I win or lose, and nobody's going to push me, I'm going to not really push myself. So that's part of why the 50s were so bad. And Vanese had drafted all of those guys. They were there. And Lombardi showed up and he made them winners, almost overnight. There's a monument across the street from Lambeau Field honoring what Jack Vanese did for the team, because he died in 1960 before he could see actually the fruits of all the players that he had brought to Green Bay. And the Vanese family is a famous Chicago family because his brother built the 1985 Chicago Bears, which were an outstanding team. So the Vanese family is really special in football, and especially for the Packers. Here's the 1961 team card, the Topps team card. This is the first championship for Lombardi. In the first year there, they won 7 games and lost 5. The year before, with the same players, they won 1 game. The next year, they get to the championship in 1960, but they lose to the Philadelphia Eagles. So in Lombardi's second year, they're already in a championship game. And in 61, they win their first championship. This is a great team. And remember when I told you that I was from New York? I cried my eyes out when the Packers beat the New York Giants 37-0 in the 1961 championship game. It just tore me apart. I was a big Y.A. Tittle, Del Schaffner, Frank Gifford fan, and the Packers just blew them right out of the water. 37-0. Now, this card is interesting. Pick a number. It doesn't matter if you know the player, but Starr's up there is 15. Nitschke's wearing 33 instead of 66. Horning's number 5 down with McGee in that second row. But just pick a number, it doesn't matter who, and just remember where they were because you're going to see something interesting. So in 61, they beat the New York Giants 37-0. This is a great photo taken in the Milwaukee County Stadium locker room during the 61 season. And you've got Jimmy Taylor on the left, Vince in the middle, Paul Horning holding a cigarette in his left hand there, and the great Bart Starr. They're all Hall of Famers. What a great photo, and the fact that it was taken in the Milwaukee County Stadium locker room was special for me. So the Packers win in 61. Here's the 62 card. Your number should be in the same place. Okay? So in 62, this is considered the greatest Packer team ever, even though this card is not the 1962 Packers. I'll tell you about that, and we got one more to go. But this team was undefeated up until Thanksgiving, and they lost to the Detroit Lions. But they bounced back, and they won the championship. This is a team considered, along with 1929 and 1966, as one of the 3 greatest teams in Packer history. They were that good. And this was a team that really made Green Bay stand out. Notice that they're in blue and gold. Okay, they're going to do this one more time. So there's the score of the New York Giants' defeat, 16-7 by the Packers. The players on the bottom of that photo are all gathering around, not Bart Starr, you can see, but another player, and that was Jerry Kramer, who kicked 3 field goals in that game. So a great game, and it was kind of the Giants, when the Packers beat them in Green Bay, the Giants thought, oh, they just beat us because it was cold and all that kind of stuff. Well, then they played this game in New York, and this game was even colder. It was Green Bay weather in New York. And the Packers won the game, and the Giants had no excuses. So they win in 61, they win in 62, they don't win in 63. But here's the 63 card. So for the 3rd time, they used the same photo. These guys, some of them could be dead. And this is the 1958 Packers. So, you know, and I guess, I don't know why they did it, but can't you just see Lombardi yelling at the photographer to get the hell out of here? These guys don't need any individual attention. You know, he was a team guy. He didn't like this glory of these players. He wanted everybody to feel the same and work hard the same way. This time they made it a little smaller, changed the colors a lot, so it kind of fooled us. I never knew this. I mean, I had that card as a kid. I never noticed it. But it is the 1960 or 58 Green Bay Packers. The reason I know it, besides the blue and gold uniforms, right here in the middle, Billy Houghton. Billy Houghton was the greatest receiver for the Packers in the 50s, but Lombardi traded him before he even got to Green Bay because he was involved in setting up the union. And Lombardi wanted nothing to do with the union, and he traded him before he even got camp going. So we got the 58 Packers still representing 61, 62, and 63. But they still win at any rate. Great photo from 58. This is the blue and gold uniform in 58. Bart Starr, great quarterback, of course. In my opinion, the greatest quarterback still of the Packers. But Aaron Rodgers, in my opinion, my least favorite of all of our quarterbacks. But he was the most talented, in my opinion. But nobody will ever surpass Bart Starr in my mind as a great quarterback. Other players, Forrest Gregg, Dave Hanner, great defensive player. He also helped coach the team under Bart Starr later in his career. The great Willie Davis. Willie Davis not only was a great player, but he was the most successful Lombardi player after football. He ran a beer distributorship, and he made lots of money. And he was a good businessman. He had a good sense of business and a great Green Bay Packer. Henry Jordan, also a great Packer to make those teams champions in 61 and 62 and beyond that. Jordan, defensive tackle, died young of a massive heart attack, but he also, those of you familiar with Summerfest in Milwaukee, he was one of the first guys to run Summerfest in Milwaukee. He was a very civic-minded man. And it was back in the day when Summerfest was all muddy and everything, when you were down there. But Henry Jordan, a civic-minded man and a great Green Bay Packer. Willie Wood, great player and a great example of how great Vince Lombardi was. Willie Wood was a star quarterback for the University of Southern California, the same team that O.J. Simpson and many, many great players went to. He was the quarterback. He graduated in 1960. Nobody drafted him. I remember as a kid, and I'm sure many of you do, black people were not expected to be smart enough to play quarterback. Too many numbers. Yeah. Too much confusion, changing plays. People didn't think black people could play quarterback. I remember it. And the first one was Doug Williams in what, in the late 70s? It was not a position where you found them putting black people. But Willie Wood's a great quarterback at a great football school, and nobody drafts him. Nobody. Nobody wants a black quarterback. He sends a letter to a number of teams. Lombardi's the only guy to answer the letter, and he brings him in for a tryout. So he brings him up to Green Bay. He gives him a tryout, and this is because Lombardi, again, sensitive to the race issue, okay, because of the color of his skin, gives the guy a tryout, but he says, you know, I got this good quarterback, Bart Starr. You know, I just can't really replace him with you. But he acknowledges the great athlete that Willie Wood is, and he helps convert him, along with Emlyn Tunnell of the New York Giants, who came over to Green Bay, helped convert him into a Hall of Fame safety. Vince Lombardi dealt directly with the race issue. Because being from New York and also having been passed over, as I mentioned, himself, he dealt with the race issue directly. He talked about it in the locker room. He felt if you were prejudiced against a person who is a different skin color, you're judging a book by its cover, it's not right. That's how he believed. And he felt he was a victim of it too, as I mentioned. So he was very open about treating each other as good human beings versus whatever color skin you are or whatever kind of clothes you wore. And so Willie Wood becomes a great player, Hall of Fame player, because Lombardi has an open mind. And it's very interesting because You know how the Packers had a rivalry with Dallas in the 60s and Tom Landry, the great coach of the Cowboys? Well, the Cowboys never made it to a Super Bowl because Tom Landry was a Southern Christian man and had difficulty with the race issue. So the only way the Cowboys got to a Super Bowl finally was when Forrest Gregg and Herb Adderley finished their last couple of years in Dallas and brought the locker room together. Because nobody talked about race in that locker room in Dallas. Everybody was a little uptight about the whole thing. And so once everybody got it out, they win a Super Bowl. And the Packers were very involved in that with those two guys. So the Packers, have great players, of course. Ray Nitschke. Ray Nitschke gets his first card in 1963, though he's been with the Packers since '58. He wasn't behaving. He liked that losing, in the 50s. Lombardi comes. They also say Nitschke got married. That made a big difference. But Lombardi wouldn't take any of his nonsense. He knew how good he was. And finally, in the early 60s, he begins to produce and is the MVP of one of our championship games in the 60s. Paul Hornung. Remember, he got caught gambling. Remember that? With Alex Karras, the defensive tackle of the Detroit Lions. They got caught gambling, and Hornung was kicked out of the league for 1 year. So the Packers don't win in '63. They don't win in '64, but this is the '64 card. And it's an unusual one because Lombardi is actually on the card. You never see him in the photos. You never see him in the other football cards, the team photos. But they have him in this card. And he's down there in that left-hand corner. He looks like a little accountant, not a football coach. And he is an accountant. He's running the whole program. So Lombardi gets on the card in '64, and they also have him on one in '65. And this is the '65 team. So they win in '61, '62, not in '63 or '64. And in '65, they win again. This is one team that's often forgotten because it's the championship right before the first Super Bowl. Okay, the first Super Bowl was at the end of the '66 season. So what happens here is the Packers have to play the Cleveland Browns for a championship in Green Bay. And here's another card of that. I went backwards, I'm sorry. Let's get this going right. So the '65 yearbook is kind of neat because they are going to win the championship in '65. But this is a very controversial cover. This is Curly Lambeau on the left shaking Vince Lombardi's hand. It's controversial because Lombardi did not care for Lambeau. The reason Lombardi didn't care for Lambeau is Lambeau was the most famous person in Wisconsin in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, known all around the country for the great things that he did with the Packers. And Lombardi, of course, thinks he's great too. Curly dies of a heart attack in '65, June of '65. They renamed the stadium before the start of the season, Lambeau Field, after Curly. Lombardi thinks the stadium should be named after him. Really? New Yorkers, and I can tell you, being one, they kind of take credit for a lot of stuff. New Yorkers love the Packers. After the Giants and Jets, I would say most New Yorkers would say the Packers are their next favorite team because they were coached by a New Yorker, so New York kind of actually won it too. That's how they are. That's how they are. And it was really something. But this photo angered Vince Lombardi to no end because he didn't like Curly. Curly was very social, very liked to drink, liked to chase women and all that kind of stuff. And Lombardi thought that was terrible, but he loved Hornung and McGee. So he didn't like Curly doing that, but he liked Hornung and McGee. But he didn't know this was going to be the cover of the '65 yearbook, and he got pretty upset. So the '65 team, though, you have all seen a photo, or not a photo, a film of the '65 championship game. Okay, it's played up in Green Bay. It's the year before the first Super Bowl. And in an advertisement, they play it every Sunday. It's American Family Insurance, I believe. And it shows Paul Hornung running around left end in the mud. That's from the '65 game. So when you see that, when the Packers are playing the Bears, and you see the American Family Insurance, and they show Paul Hornung in the mud, it's from 1965. This is the Sports Illustrated. That's Jimmy Taylor on the cover in the mud. And the Packers beat the defending champion Cleveland Browns 23-12. And so they're the 1965 champions, even though this game was played in the early part of 66. So they win in 65. The 66 team picture is not the same one, but it looks like it is, like the past, but it's not. And the 66 team has a great responsibility on its shoulders because it's going to be the first Super Bowl at the end of the year. The Super Bowl was played between the old American Football League and the NFL, and it was a rival league, and they said they were as good as the NFL, and finally they merged, and when they merged, they came up with this big game, the Super Bowl. And the Super Bowl, as you may know, was played in the Los Angeles Coliseum in front of 90,000 people. And one of the heroes, besides Bart Starr, was Max McGee. You probably have heard of the story. Max McGee doesn't plan on playing. He's going to retire. He doesn't expect to play. And you know he was a little bit of a rabble-rouser, going out late at night, breaking curfew. And so he goes out and breaks curfew with Paul Hornung, and they have a great old time. And they come back in, and McGee's not expecting to play, so you know he's at the end of the bench, kind of sitting there with a hangover. Boyd Dowler, and McGee is a backup to Boyd Dowler, the receiver. Dowler gets hurt on the first play, and so McGee has to go in, and Lombardi can't find him. And he's way at the end of the bench, and then he can't find his helmet. Once he stands up, he's looking for his helmet. And if you look at this photo, you can see he's kind of hung over a little bit. He was winded getting into the end zone. He caught the first touchdown pass in Super Bowl history. He never expected to play in the game, and he also catches another touchdown later in the game. Bart Starr was the MVP of this game, but Max could have been. Here he's catching a ball, and you can see there were empty seats. There were only 60,000 or so people that came to the first Super Bowl in the 90,000-seat LA Coliseum. So there were empty seats, believe it or not. So McGee catches 2 touchdown passes. The Packers beat the Kansas City Chiefs in the first Super Bowl, and they are the 1966 champions, but the Super Bowl is played in January of 67, but it's the end of the 66 season. So they win in 65, 66. This is not the same card, but this is the 67 Packers. And they're getting older. They're a veteran squad. Bart Starr, of course, still leading them in the preseason magazine. And what happens here in 65, or 66, oh, I'm sorry, 67, what happens is they get to the Ice Bowl to play the Dallas Cowboys for the right to get to the second Super Bowl. And this is one of my favorite collectibles because it shows Bart Starr coming over to the sidelines, actually during the game, before the final play, has an idea and says to Vince, this is what I think we should do. And Lombardi allegedly says, okay, let's run it and get the hell out of here, because it was darn cold. They could have kicked a field goal to tie it, but it would have been awful to do that. But this is a great photo. So they end up playing the Oakland Raiders in the second Super Bowl. But this is my big thing. Now, I'm not even from Wisconsin, okay? But you know that Kenny Bowman, who went to Madison, Kenny Bowman, he does not get credit for the greatest play in Packer history, and he should. So let me explain why. Let me point here on this one. In this photo, of course, you can see Bart Starr sneaking it into the end zone. Here's Bowman right here, ready to block Jethro Pugh. And here's Jerry Kramer's butt, right there. And here's Kenny Bowman. They're both going to block Jethro Pugh. Okay, Kenny Bowman got him high. Jerry Kramer got him low. Bart Starr gets into the end zone. And the Packers are Ice Bowl winners, and they go to the second Super Bowl. And in Kramer's book, Instant Replay, that he wrote after this season, he acknowledges that Kenny Bowman was an important part of this block. But after that, nope. Kenny Bowman, who's an attorney in Arizona now, probably doesn't care. But he was just as important for this block as Jerry Kramer And he's a Badger. How could we not have raised holy hell about it? Because this is the most famous play in Packer history and allows them to get to the Super Bowl, the second one, and then Lombardi wins his three straight championships. But Kenny Bowman, now here's his card. And the card will tell you why there was some issues. The hair. There was a generation gap beginning to show on the Packers. You had Starr, McGee, Horning, Dowler, all those guys, short, crew-cut hair from the 50s. Then the guys from the 60s are starting to show up. And you know, Horning and all those guys were there all through the losing 50s and into the 60s. And this guy isn't going to get any credit for this great play. He might have even been a rookie that year for all I know. But Kenny Bowman was part of the new generation of Packer players. And there was a little bit of a rub there, a little bit of envy. Because not only were they had long hair and beards and all that kind of stuff, but they got paid a lot of money up front, where the veterans got the big money at the end of their careers. You know, now it's very common for rookies to make a lot of money, but it wasn't back then. The highest paid players were Starr and McGee and Kramer and all those guys, and suddenly rookies are coming in making more money. The league changed. And so there was a little bit of a generation gap on the Packers because of that. Look at Dowler's hair. I mean, totally different groups of guys. And that's okay because they came together as a team, but there were some little issues along the way. The Gold Dust Twins, they were called. Donnie Anderson and Jim Grabowski, because they were one of the first rookies to get paid a lot of money. And it really angered the veterans. But the Packers go to that Super Bowl in 1968. It's the end of the 67 season. And they do beat the Oakland Raiders. And now here are all the bad coaches after Lombardi quits after that game. You've got Bankston, Devine, Starr, Gregg, and at the bottom there you can't see Lindy Infante. But look at the winning percentage. Down, 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 down to 375 at the end, 37% of the games. I remember when I came out here from New York and it was Sunday, nobody stayed home for Packer games. They were at Mayfair, they were at Brookfield Square, and if you could see a little TV in Walgreens to keep up on the game, you could see it there. But nobody stayed home. It wasn't a social event because they lost. I mean, look at all the 20 and 21, 25 and 27, 52 and 76. They were terrible. And so finally, Bob Harlan, one of my heroes, he's a Marquette boy, so I have to love the guy. And he works his way up through the organization, and he says, football people need to run this team, not other people that are business people. They don't know football. So Harlan saves the team. People are ready to give up on the Packers. They hadn't won a Super Bowl in 28 years. And Bob Harlan is able to resurrect the franchise. Of course, he hires Ron Wolf, who comes in to lead the team. They bring Mike Holmgren in as an assistant coach of the San Francisco 49ers. And then, of course, they stake their careers as new people in Green Bay on a drinking happy quarterback for the Atlanta Falcons. They give away a #1 draft choice. They put their careers on the line for this guy.
Yeah.
But Wolf believed in him, and he certainly knew something, because Favre helps turn the franchise around, of course, with Reggie White, who, remember the fun phone call from Holmgren. He calls up Reggie and he says, "Reggie, this is God. Go to Green Bay." And so that, along with the $13 million, I'm sure helped him make that decision. So Reggie comes. Here's a great photo of them on the cover of Time magazine. I remember where I was when they became champions again, and I'm sure you do too. The great Leroy Butler, Hall of Fame member as well. The big Gilbert Brown, who never saw a hamburger he didn't like. But I have to say he's especially sweet because he was a former Minnesota Viking. So he came over to us and really made a big difference on the defensive line. They get to the championship game in '96 against the Carolina Panthers on another cold day at Lambeau Field. They win that game and they go down to New Orleans to play in Brett Favre's backyard for the Super Bowl. It's pretty incredible. I remember this where I was, and it was just so great to see this, traditionally great franchise be resurrected by the great Bob Harlan. So Favre throws a touchdown pass on the first or second play of the game. They're off and running. Reggie has 3 second-half sacks of Drew Bledsoe, the quarterback of the Boston Patriots. And the Packers come away winners 35-21. Favre is on the right-hand side of that photo up on the dais already. And so the Packers get back to the Super Bowl, win it for the first time in 28, 29 years. Just incredible. Desmond Howard, MVP of that game for all the return yardage. Yeah. And remember back then, the MVPs of the game went to Disneyland or Disney World. That was the big thing. The Packers win, they come back, ticker tape parade, cold day in Green Bay. The Packers say they're not getting out of the bus, and they pull into Lambeau Field. This is just a different photo. They pull into Lambeau Field, and it's packed with the fans, and all the players are like, okay, I guess we're getting out of the bus. But it was a very, very cold day. This is a photo of that team with Brett Favre in the first row on the bottom left there, Holmgren right in the middle as the head coach. And the next photo is the photo of Aaron Rodgers, our last Super Bowl winning team. Notice all the guys in the white shirts. Those are all assistant coaches. Curly Lambeau had one assistant coach, but the game obviously has changed a lot of specialties and things like that. This team, however, wins the Super Bowl unexpectedly. They won, they got hot at the end of the year. They beat the Giants and the Bears. They got into the Super Bowl as the lowest seeded team in the Super Bowl tournament, if you'd say that's the right way to say it, I'm not sure, but they were a low-seeded team. Great quarterback, Aaron Rodgers, just a tremendous year. Donald Driver, great receiver. The dancing king, too, right? Just an interesting guy, and one of those human beings, like I said before, who's just a great person. And Charles Woodson, another one of those great people. Charles Woodson, they thought his career was over when he came to Green Bay, and it certainly was not over. And he's a Hall of Famer, and even acknowledged Green Bay a lot in his Hall of Fame speech. In 2010, remember, Favre has gone because he said he couldn't win a Super Bowl in Green Bay. He goes to the Jets. They trade him to Minnesota the next year. He beats us twice his first year with Minnesota, and in 2010 we beat him twice to get to the Super Bowl. And he didn't think we could get there and had left. But we got to the Super Bowl with Rodgers. Great Super Bowl. Tramon Williams intercepting Michael Vick of the Eagles in the first round of this Super Bowl. Then we move on to one of Rodgers' great games, still one of his greatest games, against the Atlanta Falcons, who were the #1 seed in the Super Bowl that year. Beat them 45-10, I think the score was, something like that. It was a real blowout, and really showed how great the Packers were. And then, of course, we have the game of games. They have to play the Bears, and the winner goes to the Super Bowl. So there wasn't much more on the line than that. And B.J. Raji makes a great interception and helps lead us to a victory over the Bears. He does a little dance in the end zone. Supersized, he certainly was. And great guy, and a smart guy. He got out of football young. He's a defensive lineman, so he took a little concern about his own health and retired early. So they get to that Super Bowl, and they're going to play the Pittsburgh Steelers, another great franchise. And Nick Collins makes a great interception to a pick six, actually, to defeat them and get the game started in Green Bay's direction. Rodgers and Nelson have a great game. Rodgers and Greg Jennings as well had a great game. And they finally win that championship. I mean, it was kind of like there was no pressure on. I remember watching the game hoping they would win, but I didn't feel any pressure because they weren't expected to win. And now, we expect the Packers to win all the time. We're getting like New York Yankee fans. We are. Because if we don't win, it's not a good year. Yeah. And it's kind of hard to put that on the team because there's only one winner, and football is a hard game to win the whole thing in. But this is a great picture, and after they get to that Super Bowl, they're a young team, and everybody's expecting, this is the first of a lot of Super Bowls to come. Great headline with Nick Collins and his interception. Sports Illustrated celebrating the championship. And here's what Rogers says at the end. As a kid, I always wanted to go to the Super Bowl. Now that I've got one, it's like, now what? Let's go get another one. We know how that's turned out, right? We got close, but not quite close enough. And the last card to show you is a card I bought in 2006. And it has all the quarterbacks, the 3 great quarterbacks on the Packers. And I thought, well, maybe since Rodgers didn't actually start playing until 2008, maybe this card will be worth something someday, and it's not. Because what they did is they took the G out and put autographs there. And then they took the autographs out and they put patches of team jerseys there. So this card became, it's just a photo of these guys. So that is all the information I have for you today. I think that's the last one. Yeah, that's it. Any questions that you have about the 13? I'm running a little long on you, so I'm sorry. Anything you want to ask? Any questions? And you were a very well-behaved class, I have to say. The books are over there, $10 if you're interested. If not, thank you for coming. I appreciate whenever I get to a senior center, a number of folks are here, because you know what all this stuff was like. You remember, you lived it. So thank you again. Go Pack. Bears coming up Sunday.